In the autumn mists of 1941, as Wehrmacht columns carved through the heartland of Poland, SS and German police authorities in the general government conceived a facility that would become synonymous with the methodical erasure of human life. In November 1941, SS and German police authorities established a forced labor camp for Jews known as Treblinka. The location, 50 miles northeast of Warsaw along the main Warsaw-Białystok railway line, was chosen with calculated precision. Here, where the Małkinia Junction split the arterial flow of rail traffic, the Reich would construct its most efficient machinery of death. The first Treblinka emerged from the November soil as a penal labor camp, its barbed wire enclosing Poles and Jews in the service of German quarry operations. But this modest beginning would soon be overshadowed by a far more sinister design. As Heinrich Himmler's vision of the final solution crystallized into operational reality, the forest clearing near the village of Treblinka was selected for a second, more terrible purpose. The killing center, referred to as Treblinka II, was constructed in the summer of 1942. The genesis of Treblinka II lay within Action Reinhard, the Nazi codename for their systematic plan to murder the Jewish population of the general government. Named after Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of genocide whose assassination in Prague had sent shockwaves through the Reich hierarchy, this operation would establish 3 killing centers: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Under the supervision of SS Oberführer Odilo Globoknik, who declared his mission as the complete elimination of all Jews in the general government, and the direct oversight of Christian Wirth, a man whose expertise in mass murder had been honed during the Nazi euthanasia program, these camps would function as pure instruments of extermination. Construction of Treblinka II commenced in May 1942, orchestrated with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all Nazi enterprises. Ukrainian auxiliaries, trained at the Treblinka camp, labored alongside German technicians to erect what would become the deadliest of the Reinhard camps. The facility was designed not as a place of prolonged internment, but as a killing machine of unprecedented capacity and speed. Within its compact 40-acre footprint, the architects of death would create a theater of deception so complete that victims would walk willingly to their destruction. The first commandant, Dr. Irmfried Ebel, arrived in July 1942 with credentials steeped in the Nazi euthanasia program. A physician by training, Ebel had overseen the murder of thousands of disabled individuals at Bernburg and Brandenburg, perfecting the use of carbon monoxide gas as an instrument of mass death. When questioned after the war, he would claim, "I only carried out orders that came from the highest authorities." His appointment to Treblinka represented the transfer of euthanasia expertise to the broader genocide, a seamless evolution from the murder of the disabled to the extermination of the Jews. As summer deepened into the killing season of 1942, the first transports began their final journey along the rails that led to Treblinka. The camp's initial operations, however, revealed fatal flaws in Ebel's management. Trains arrived faster than bodies could be disposed of, creating a grotesque backlog that threatened to expose the camp's true purpose to the outside world. Corpses rotted in the summer heat, and the stench of death carried for miles across the Polish countryside. Christian Wirth, conducting an inspection, was appalled by the chaos, later reporting, "Eberl has created a disaster that threatens the entire operation." By August, even Heinrich Himmler himself recognized that Eberl's chaotic methods endangered the secrecy upon which the entire operation depended. The theater of deception. The dismissal of Eberl in late August 1942 marked the beginning of Treblinka's transformation into a perfected killing machine. His replacement, Franz Stangl, brought to the position an Austrian precision and a talent for elaborate deception that would make Treblinka the deadliest of the Reinhard camps. Stangl, who had previously commanded Sobibor, understood that the key to efficient mass murder lay not in brutal chaos, but in the meticulous orchestration of illusion. As he would later explain to interviewer Gitta Serini, The only way to deal with it was to do it as quickly and efficiently as possible. Under Stangel's direction, Treblinka II was reimagined as an elaborate theatrical production, with every element designed to maintain the fiction that the arriving passengers were merely in transit to labor camps in the east. The railway siding was transformed into a convincing replica of a legitimate train station, complete with painted signs advertising connections to distant cities, a false clock perpetually frozen at an optimistic hour, and even a fake Deutsche Reichsbahn information booth staffed by uniformed prisoners. The centerpiece of this ghastly theater was the construction of an artificial railway platform, elevated and expanded to accommodate entire trains. Here, SS men in crisp uniforms would greet the arriving transports with practiced efficiency, their voices carrying rehearsed announcements about luggage storage, shower facilities, and work assignments. Franz Suchomel, an SS officer at the camp, would later recall the deception. "We told them they were going to have a shower, and afterwards they would get soup." The platform itself bore the painted signs of a functioning station, Treblinka in Gothic lettering, directional arrows pointing to Białystok and Volkowisk, and posted schedules for trains that would never come. Beyond the platform, the camp's geography had been carefully designed to channel the flow of human traffic toward a single destination, a path euphemistically called der Schlauch, the tube or funnel, led from the arrival platform toward the gas chambers. This narrow corridor, bordered by high fences woven with pine branches to obscure the view, created a natural bottleneck that prevented prisoners from dispersing or organizing resistance. The path curved gently, preventing new arrivals from seeing what lay ahead until it was too late. Along this pathway of death, the Germans constructed additional elements of their elaborate deception. A false infirmary, bearing a red cross and staffed by a German in a doctor's coat, welcomed those too sick or elderly to walk the final distance. This lazaret was in reality an open pit surrounded by sandbags, where SS men would dispatch victims with a bullet to the neck before throwing their bodies into the flames that burned constantly within. The gas chambers themselves were disguised as shower facilities, complete with overhead fixtures designed to resemble shower heads, benches for undressing, and signs in multiple languages instructing new arrivals to hang their clothing on numbered hooks and remember their numbers for retrieval after disinfection. Jankiel Wienik observed, "Over the entrance door was a sign reading, 'Baths and Disinfection Rooms.' These details, seemingly minor, represented hours of careful planning by men who understood that successful deception required attention to every psychological element that might calm their victims' fears. The buildings housing the gas chambers were constructed to resemble a substantial bathhouse, with windows that had been bricked up from the inside but retained their external frames to maintain the illusion. A Star of David was painted above the entrance, along with Hebrew inscriptions, to suggest that this was a facility operated by Jewish authorities for the welfare of the prisoners. Even the landscaping around the buildings was maintained with flower beds and decorative plants, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that masked the industrial killing within. Franz Stangl himself embodied this theatre of deception, appearing each day in pressed uniforms, polished boots and white gloves, riding his white horse through the camp like a commandant of a military installation rather than a death factory. His deputy, Kurt Franz, nicknamed Lalka, the doll, for his youthful appearance, maintained this facade of respectability even as he trained his dog, Barry, to attack prisoners on command and oversee the daily operations of mass murder. Daily rhythms of death. The operational efficiency that Stangl brought to Treblinka established a rhythm of death that would persist with mechanical regularity from September 1942 through August 1943. From July 1942 to August 1943, carbon monoxide gas was used in gas chambers to murder hundreds of people at a time. Overall, between 780,000 and 925,000 Jewish prisoners were murdered during this period, most murdered within just hours of arriving at the camp. Each day brought its predetermined sequence of arrivals, selections and killings, orchestrated with the precision of an industrial process. The trains typically arrived in the early morning hours, their cattle cars packed with human cargo that had endured journeys of several days without food, water, or sanitation. Chiel Reichman, a survivor of Treblinka, was on one of these transports and described the journey to the camp in his book Treblinka, A Survivor's Memory. "There are about 140 of us in the freight wagon. It is extraordinarily tight with dense stale air, all of us pressed against one another." The journey itself had been designed as an element of the killing process, weakening victims physically and psychologically before their arrival at the camp. Upon arrival at the false station platform, the SS would begin their practiced performance of deception. Uniformed guards would shout instructions in German and broken Polish, directing the new arrivals to disembark quickly and form orderly lines. Samuel Willenberg recalled the arrival process. The SS men were shouting, "Everyone out! Leave your luggage on the platform. You will get it back after the shower." The elderly and infirm were immediately separated and directed toward the false infirmary, where they would be killed with pistol shots before their bodies were thrown into the constantly burning pits. The remaining prisoners were herded into the reception area, where they were ordered to undress completely, ostensibly for showers and delousing. Their clothing and belongings were quickly sorted by teams of Jewish prisoners who had been kept alive specifically for this purpose. These Sonderkommandos, as they were known, worked under the constant threat of death, knowing that their survival depended on their efficiency in processing the possessions of the murdered. The German guards maintained their deception even as they drove the naked prisoners along the Schlauch toward the gas chambers. They would shout encouragements about the importance of cleanliness, the need to work hard in the labor camps, and the temporary nature of their separation from family members. Some guards even distributed pieces of soap and small towels to maintain the illusion of a bathing facility. Richard Glazar remembered the guards calling out, "Hurry up! The water is getting cold. Others are waiting for the showers." The gas chambers themselves were relatively small buildings, each capable of holding approximately 700 people when packed to suffocation. The victims were forced inside through heavy doors, which were then sealed from the outside. A diesel engine, originally from a captured Soviet tank, pumped carbon monoxide through pipes into the chambers. Death typically occurred within 30 to 40 minutes, though the agonized screams of the dying could be heard across the camp for the duration of the process. Jankiel Wiernik wrote, "Between 10,000 and 12,000 people were gassed each day." Wiernik also wrote, "The number of transports grew daily, and there were periods when as many as 30,000 people were gassed in one day." These staggering numbers reflect the industrial scale of the killing process during peak periods of operation. Wiernik further observed, "The screaming of the victims could be heard from a great distance, and it would continue for about 15 minutes. After the gas had completed its work, another team of Sonderkommandos would be forced to enter the chambers to remove the bodies. These men, working naked to prevent the concealment of valuables, would drag the corpses from the chambers and search them for hidden jewelry, gold teeth, and other items of value. The systematic extraction of wealth from the dead represented another layer of the Nazi exploitation, ensuring that even in death, their victims would serve the economic interests of the Reich. The bodies were initially buried in enormous pits dug by mechanical excavators and prisoner labor. However, as the scale of killing intensified and concerns about groundwater contamination and discovery arose, the Germans ordered the exhumation and burning of all corpses. This transition from burial to cremation marked a new phase in the camp's operations, as massive pyres were constructed from railroad ties and fueled by the bodies themselves. The commanders of death. The SS officers who administered Treblinka represented a cross-section of Nazi bureaucratic efficiency and pathological cruelty, men who had transformed the act of mass murder into a professional career. At their head stood Franz Stangl, whose background as a police superintendent in Austria had prepared him well for the administrative challenges of genocide. When later questioned about his role, Stangl would coldly state, "My conscience is clear. I was simply doing my duty. Stangel's approach to command was characterized by an obsessive attention to detail and a commitment to maintaining the elaborate deceptions that made Treblinka so deadly. Stangel's daily routine reflected his commitment to the theatre of normalcy. Each morning he would appear in his meticulously pressed uniform, complete with peaked cap and white gloves, to survey his domain from the back of his white horse. This display of military bearing served multiple purposes. It reinforced the illusion of Treblinka as a legitimate transit facility for any outside observers, maintained discipline among his subordinates, and provided a psychological distance from the reality of mass murder that allowed him to function with bureaucratic efficiency. His deputy, Kurt Franz, brought a different but equally sinister energy to the camp's operations. Franz combined sadistic cruelty with administrative competence. Franz would later boast, "I was always a good soldier and I always did my duty." He was responsible for training the camp's most notorious four-legged enforcer, a dog named Barry, who had been conditioned to attack prisoners on command, particularly targeting their genitals. Franz's innovation in using animal terror as a control mechanism reflected the systematic dehumanization that characterized every aspect of Treblinka's operations. The organizational structure beneath Stangl and Franz included a cadre of SS officers, each responsible for specific aspects of the killing process. Heinrich Mattes oversaw the gas chambers themselves, ensuring that the mechanical systems functioned efficiently and that the Sonderkommandos maintained the necessary pace of body removal. His expertise in the technical aspects of mass murder had been developed through previous service in the euthanasia program, where he had learned to view killing as a problem of engineering rather than morality. Willy Mentz commanded the extermination area, the section of the camp where the gas chambers and burning pits were located. When questioned after the war, Mentz would claim, "We were told that the Jews were enemies of the German people and had to be destroyed." This position required not only administrative skills, but also the psychological capacity to oversee the daily murder of thousands of people without apparent emotional disturbance, treating mass murder as a logistics problem to be optimized. The camp's German staff was supplemented by Ukrainian auxiliaries, men who had been recruited from prisoner of war camps and trained at Trauniki to serve as guards and executioners. These Trauniki men, as they were known, formed the backbone of the camp's daily operations, manning the guard towers, herding prisoners along the Schlauch, and operating the diesel engines that pumped carbon monoxide into the gas chambers. Among these auxiliaries, certain individuals achieved particular notoriety for their cruelty. Ivan Marchenko, known to prisoners as Ivan the Terrible, operated the diesel engine that supplied gas to the chambers with evident sadistic pleasure. Survivors later described his habit of prolonging the killing process, allowing the engine to run irregularly to extend the agony of those trapped inside. Survivor Abraham Goldfarb testified, "Ivan would hit people with an iron pipe, and he enjoyed every moment of it." His counterpart, Nikolai Shalayev, was remembered for his use of a sword to mutilate prisoners, often cutting off ears and noses as a form of entertainment. The psychological dynamics among this group of perpetrators reflected the broader patterns of Nazi genocide. The German officers maintained their sense of professional respectability through bureaucratic distance and elaborate protocols, while the Ukrainian auxiliaries were encouraged to express their brutality directly. This division of labor allowed the Germans to maintain their self-image as civilized administrators, while ensuring that the actual violence was carried out by men they considered racially inferior. According to post-war testimonies, when transports were temporarily halted, then Deputy Commandant Kurt Franz wrote lyrics to a song meant to celebrate the Treblinka extermination camp. In reality, prisoner Walter Hirsch wrote them for him. The lyrics began, "Looking squarely ahead, brave and joyous, at the world, the squads marched to work." This detail reveals the extent to which the camp's commanders sought to create a culture that celebrated their work, transforming mass murder into a source of institutional pride and camaraderie. The Sonderkommandos, witnesses to death. Within the machinery of Treblinka, no position was more terrible than that of the Sonderkommandos, the Jewish prisoners who were kept alive to facilitate the murder of their fellow Jews. These men existed in a liminal space between life and death, their survival contingent on their willingness and ability to participate in the processing of corpses and the extraction of valuables from the dead. Their testimonies, preserved through the accounts of survivors and escapees, provide the most detailed and harrowing descriptions of the camp's daily operations. The selection of Sonderkommandos typically occurred during the initial sorting process at the railway platform. SS officers would identify men who appeared physically capable of heavy labor, separating them from the general population before the march to the gas chambers began. These selected individuals would be informed that they were being assigned to work details, though the true nature of their work would not be revealed until they were already trapped within the camp's machinery of death. Chill Reichmann, one of the few Sonderkommandos to survive both the camp and the war, later described his first day of work in vivid detail. Assigned to the team responsible for removing bodies from the gas chambers, he was forced to witness the results of mass murder on an industrial scale. The chambers, when opened, revealed scenes of unimaginable horror. Hundreds of corpses twisted together in their final agony, faces contorted by the poisonous gas, bodies bearing the marks of desperate attempts to claw through solid walls in search of air. The work of the Sonderkommandos extended far beyond simple body removal, cutting the hair from female corpses, which would be collected and shipped to Germany for use in textiles. They extracted gold teeth using pliers and hammers, filling buckets with dental gold that would be melted down and sent to the Reich's treasury. They sorted through clothing and personal belongings, separating items of value from those deemed worthless by their captors. Samuel Willenberg, another survivor who would later write extensively about his experiences, described the psychological torture inherent in this work. The Sonderkommandos were forced to maintain efficiency while processing the bodies of people they had often known in life, neighbors from their hometowns, fellow passengers from their transport trains, sometimes even family members. The Germans understood that this psychological burden served as an additional form of control. The living conditions for the Sonderkommandos were marginally better than those of new arrivals, but remained deliberately precarious. They were housed in barracks within the camp's operational area, where they could be constantly monitored by the guards. Their food consisted primarily of items taken from the luggage of murdered victims, creating another layer of psychological torment as they consumed bread and preserves that had been packed by families who had hoped to sustain themselves during resettlement. Yankiel Wiernik, a carpenter who became one of the leaders of the eventual uprising, used his professional skills to make himself indispensable to the camp's operations. Assigned to maintenance and construction work, he gained greater freedom of movement than most Sonderkommandos, allowing him to observe the full scope of the camp's operations. His later memoir, 1 Year in Treblinka, published in 1944, provided one of the first detailed accounts of the camp's structure and operations to reach the outside world. The turnover among Sonderkommandos was deliberately high. SS officers would regularly select groups of these workers for execution, both to prevent the accumulation of detailed knowledge about the camp's operations and to maintain psychological pressure on the survivors. New arrivals would be selected to replace the murdered workers, ensuring a constant supply of forced labor while preventing the development of organized resistance networks. Despite these constraints, the Sonderkommandos managed to maintain elements of human dignity and mutual support. Willenberg described how experienced workers would mentor newcomers, teaching them survival strategies and helping them cope with the psychological trauma of their work. They developed coded language systems to communicate information about escape possibilities and resistance planning without alerting the guards. Some Sonderkommandos attempted to document the horrors they witnessed, recognizing their role as potential witnesses to crimes that the perpetrators hoped to conceal completely. They wrote notes on scraps of paper and hid them in the hope that future generations would learn what had occurred at Treblinka. These fragments of testimony, most of which were never recovered, represented acts of resistance that defied their captors' attempts to erase all evidence of their crimes. The machinery of disposal. The evolution of body disposal at Treblinka reflected the Germans' growing awareness of the logistical challenges posed by mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Initially, the thousands of corpses produced daily were simply buried in enormous pits dug by mechanical excavators and prisoner labor. These mass graves, located in the forest area beyond the gas chambers, were designed as a temporary solution to the problem of concealing evidence while the killing continued at maximum efficiency. However, by early 1943, several factors converged to force a fundamental change in disposal methods. The groundwater in the area had become contaminated with decomposition products, creating a public health hazard that threatened to draw unwanted attention from local Polish authorities. More significantly, Heinrich Himmler had issued orders across all camps to eliminate evidence of mass murder through the systematic exhumation and burning of corpses, a directive that reflected growing Nazi concerns about eventual Allied discovery of their crimes. The transition from burial to cremation marked the beginning of one of Treblinka's most horrific phases. Under the supervision of SS Unterscharführer Herbert Floss, who had been transferred from Sobibor specifically for his expertise in corpse burning, massive open-air cremation facilities were constructed throughout the camp. These pyres, built from railroad ties arranged in careful geometric patterns, were designed to achieve maximum burning efficiency while minimizing fuel consumption. The exhumation process required the expansion of the Sonderkommando workforce, as teams of prisoners were assigned to dig up the mass graves and transport the decomposing bodies to the burning sites. This work, performed without protective equipment under the constant threat of execution, exposed the workers to extreme health hazards. The bodies, many of which had been buried for months, had swollen and burst in the ground, creating scenes of indescribable horror that traumatized even men who had already witnessed systematic mass murder. The pyres burned continuously, day and night, consuming thousands of bodies each day, while producing columns of smoke and ash that were visible for miles across the Polish countryside. Though local residents had learned through bitter experience not to investigate or report what they witnessed. The constant glow of the fires at night created an otherworldly atmosphere that survivors would later describe as resembling depictions of hell in medieval art. The ash and bone fragments that remained after burning presented their own disposal challenges. Teams of Sonderkommandos were assigned to pulverize the remaining bone fragments using heavy clubs and metal grinders, reducing them to powder that could be scattered in the surrounding forest or used as fertilizer in the camp's vegetable gardens. This final desecration ensured that virtually no physical trace remained of the hundreds of thousands of people who had been murdered at Treblinka. The efficiency of this disposal system reached its peak during the spring and summer of 1943, when the camp was simultaneously processing new arrivals while eliminating evidence of previous murders. During this period, witnesses reported that as many as 3,000 bodies could be burned in a single day, creating an industrial-scale cremation operation that exceeded the capacity of any civilian facility. The psychological impact on the Sonderkommandos forced to carry out this work cannot be overstated. Many of these men were handling the remains of people they had known in life, fellow residents of their hometown ghettos who had been murdered months earlier and were now being exhumed for burning. The work required them to confront the ultimate fate that awaited them, as they knew that their own knowledge of the disposal process made them particularly dangerous witnesses who would eventually be eliminated. The Revolt. By the summer of 1943, the Sonderkommandos at Treblinka had reached a collective understanding that their own deaths were inevitable, whether through exhaustion, selection for execution, or the eventual closure of the camp. This recognition, combined with growing awareness that the tide of war was turning against Germany, catalyzed the planning of an armed uprising that would become one of the most significant acts of resistance in the history of the Holocaust. The revolt's conception emerged from the leadership of several key figures among the prisoners, men whose positions within the camp's hierarchy provided them with both access to information and freedom of movement necessary for conspiracy. Jankiel Wiernik, whose carpentry work took him throughout the facility, served as a crucial intelligence gatherer, mapping the camp's layout and identifying vulnerabilities in its security systems. Dr. Julian Chorążycki, a Warsaw physician who served as the camp's medical officer, used his privileged position to establish contact networks among the various work details. Planning for the uprising required months of careful preparation conducted under the constant threat of discovery and execution. The conspirators had to identify potential weapons, map escape routes, and coordinate timing among prisoners spread across different areas of the camp. The conspirators developed a sophisticated system for stealing and manufacturing arms, including the forging of keys to access German supply areas where pistols and rifles were stored. On the 2nd of August 1943, an armed uprising organized by prisoners broke out in the camp. Out of 840 people, only about 200 managed to escape. Not more than 100 survived the war. The timing of the revolt was triggered by intelligence that the camp was being prepared for closure and that all remaining prisoners would soon be executed to eliminate witnesses. The uprising began in the early afternoon when the conspirators gained access to the German armory and distributed weapons among the participants. The initial phase involved coordinated attacks on guard positions and attempts to cut the barbed wire surrounding the camp. The sound of gunfire and explosions quickly spread panic throughout the facility as prisoners who had not been informed of the plot began to realize what was occurring. Samuel Willenberg, who participated in the revolt, later described the chaotic intensity of the escape attempt. Armed prisoners engaged in firefights with German and Ukrainian guards, while others attempted to reach the perimeter fences. The camp's layout, with its narrow corridors and multiple barriers, initially hindered the escape attempts, but also prevented the guards from effectively coordinating their response. A group of armed Jews attacked along the way. Partisans of the Armia Krajowa transported some of the surviving escapees across the river, and others like Sperling ran 30 kilometers and were then helped and fed by Polish villagers. The assistance provided by Polish partisans and civilians proved crucial to the survival of many escapees, though the majority of those who broke through the camp's perimeter were eventually recaptured and killed. The revolt succeeded in its primary objective of destroying much of the camp's infrastructure and disrupting its operations, even though the majority of participants died in the attempt. Buildings were set on fire, fuel supplies were destroyed, and the camp's administrative records were burned, eliminating evidence that the Germans had hoped to preserve for their own purposes. The aftermath of the uprising marked the beginning of Treblinka's systematic destruction. Rather than attempting to resume full operations, the Germans decided to accelerate the camp's closure and the elimination of all remaining evidence. Of those who broke through, around 70 are known to have survived until the end of the war, including the future authors of published Treblinka memoirs, Richard Glaser, Chill Reichmann, Jankiel Wiernik, and Samuel Willenberg. These survivors would later provide crucial testimony about the camp's operations and the revolt itself. The dismantling and cover-up. The August uprising at Treblinka accelerated German plans for the camp's closure and the systematic elimination of all evidence of mass murder. After the uprising, the camp was being slowly shut down. In November 1943, the camp's structures were dismantled. This process of concealment represented one of the most comprehensive attempts in history to erase physical evidence of genocide, reflecting Nazi awareness that their crimes would eventually face international scrutiny. The dismantling operation was overseen by the same SS officers who had administered the killing process, now applying their organizational skills to the task of concealment. Every building within the camp was systematically demolished, with special attention paid to the gas chambers and cremation facilities that had served as the instruments of mass murder. The concrete foundations were broken up and scattered, while metal components were removed for recycling in German industrial facilities. The elimination of physical evidence extended far beyond simple demolition. Teams of prisoners, working under guard, were forced to scatter the ashes from the cremation pyres throughout the surrounding forest, ensuring that no concentrations of human remains could be easily identified by future investigators. The mass graves that had been excavated during the transition to burning were filled with sand and debris, then carefully landscaped to disguise their original purpose. To complete the deception, the Germans undertook an ambitious project to transform the entire campsite into an apparently legitimate agricultural facility. A farmhouse was constructed on the former location of the gas chambers, while the surrounding area was planted with crops and trees to create the appearance of a working farm. A Ukrainian collaborator, Streibel, was installed as the nominal owner of this property, providing a cover story for any local residents who might question the site's history. The railroad infrastructure that had delivered hundreds of thousands of victims to their deaths was also systematically altered. The false train station was demolished, and the siding tracks were removed and relocated to eliminate evidence of their connection to mass transport operations. The main railway line continued to function normally, carrying freight and passenger traffic past the former death camp without any indication of its previous purpose. Personnel involved in the camp's operations were systematically reassigned or eliminated to prevent their testimony from exposing the truth. Many of the Ukrainian auxiliaries were transferred to other facilities or simply murdered, while German officers were given new assignments in different theaters of the war. This dispersal of witnesses was intended to make it difficult for future investigators to reconstruct the camp's operations through survivor testimony. The few remaining Jewish prisoners who had survived the August uprising were executed during the final weeks of the dismantling process, eliminating the most knowledgeable witnesses to the camp's operations. Only those who had successfully escaped during the revolt remained alive to provide testimony about what had occurred at Treblinka, and many of these survivors would spend the remainder of the war hiding from both German forces and local populations who might betray them. Local Polish residents were warned to avoid the area and were told that it remained under German military control for security purposes. This restriction on access served the dual purpose of preventing discovery of any remaining evidence while also limiting the number of witnesses who might observe the cover-up operations. The Germans understood that successful concealment required not only the elimination of physical evidence, but also the control of information about their activities. The weight of testimony. The voices of Treblinka's survivors emerged from the war carrying testimonies of such systematic horror that many initially struggled to believe their accounts. These men, for the vast majority of survivors were male, had witnessed the machinery of death in operation and lived to describe it in detail that challenged human comprehension. Their testimonies, preserved in memoirs, court proceedings, and interviews, constitute the primary source of knowledge about the camp's operations and the most complete documentation of industrialized mass murder. Yankiel Wiernik, whose carpentry skills had made him indispensable to the camp's operations, published his account 1 year in Treblinka as early as 1944, while the war still raged across Europe. His memoir provided the first detailed description of the camp's layout, operations and personnel to reach a wide audience, though many readers initially dismissed his account as propaganda or exaggeration. Wiernik wrote with technical precision. The ground was littered with bodies. Some of them were still alive, but most of them were already dead. Their faces were blue from the gas. His technical background allowed him to document the construction and operation of the gas chambers with precision that later proved crucial for historical verification. Samuel Willenberg, who participated in the August 1943 uprising and successfully escaped, spent decades after the war documenting his experiences and those of his fellow survivors. In his memoir, Revolt in Treblinka, he recalled the moment of uprising. At exactly 3:45 p.m., we heard the signal shot. The revolt had begun. His detailed knowledge of the camp's personnel, particularly the SS officers and Ukrainian guards, proved invaluable for post-war prosecution efforts. Chill Reichmann's memoir, The Last Jew of Treblinka, offered perhaps the most harrowing personal account of survival within the camp's machinery of death. He wrote of the arrival process. The platform was already crowded with thousands of people with their bundles, women with children in their arms, and all were shouting, "Water, water!" His documentation of the daily rhythms of mass murder provided crucial details about operational aspects that official German records had deliberately obscured. Richard Gleiser, a Czech Jew who survived both Treblinka and the subsequent years of hiding and persecution, wrote extensively about the psychological dimensions of survival. In Trap with a Green Fence, he observed, "We had stopped being human beings in the normal sense. We had become something else, witnesses to our own nightmare." He explored the mental strategies that enabled some prisoners to maintain their sanity while participating in the machinery of mass murder. These testimonies faced skepticism that reflected both the unprecedented nature of the crimes and the systematic German efforts to eliminate evidence. Meanwhile, the perpetrators themselves pursued various fates. Franz Stangl fled to Brazil, living under an assumed identity until his capture in 1967 and subsequent life sentence in Germany. Kurt Franz was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1965. Many Ukrainian guards melted back into civilian life, their crimes undetected for decades. Others, like Christian Wirth, died during the war, escaping earthly justice entirely. The survivors carried not only their own memories but also the responsibility of speaking for the hundreds of thousands who had perished without leaving any trace. Kalman Teigman, who testified at the Eichmann trial in Israel, described the weight of this obligation to ensure that the dead were not forgotten and that the world understood the full scope of what had occurred. Historical reckoning and the silence of commemoration. The decades following the war witnessed a gradual process of historical investigation that slowly confirmed the testimonies of Treblinka's survivors, though this recognition came at the cost of prolonged silence and deliberate forgetting. Unlike Auschwitz, which retained substantial physical evidence and became a symbol of Holocaust memory, Treblinka's systematic destruction left behind a landscape that revealed few traces of its terrible history. This absence of visible remains contributed to what historian Rachel Auerbach called the silence of the vanished, a phenomenon that allowed the camp's crimes to fade from public consciousness even as scholarly research began to document their scope. The scholarly reconstruction of Treblinka's history relied heavily on the pioneering work of historian Yitzhak Arad, whose comprehensive research on the Action Reinhard camps provided the first systematic academic examination of these facilities. Arad's meticulous analysis of German documents, survivor testimonies, and post-war interrogations established the methodological framework for understanding Treblinka within the broader context of Nazi genocide. His work revealed the careful planning and administrative coordination that characterized the Reinhard camps, demonstrating that these facilities represented not spontaneous outbreaks of violence, but calculated instruments of state policy. Archaeological investigations conducted in the 1960s under the direction of Polish researchers provided the first scientific confirmation of survivor testimonies. These excavations, limited in scope due to the site's designation as a memorial, nonetheless uncovered fragments of bone, ash, and personal belongings that validated the accounts of mass murder that had been preserved in survivor memoirs. The discovery of the gas chamber foundations, buried beneath layers of sand and debris, offered physical proof of the killing machinery that witnesses had described in such precise detail. The documentation efforts of Polish railway dispatcher Franciszek Ząbecki proved crucial for establishing the scale of deportations to Treblinka. Working at the Małkinia Junction, Ząbecki secretly recorded the arrival times, origins, and approximate passenger numbers of trains bound for the camp, creating an invaluable record that survived the war hidden in his family's possession. His meticulous documentation provided historians with concrete evidence of the transport operations that had delivered hundreds of thousands of victims to their deaths. Franz Stangel's capture in Brazil in 1967 and subsequent trial in Germany brought renewed attention to the camp, though his conviction came 24 years after the crimes had been committed. During his trial, Stangl maintained that he had merely administered a facility whose purpose was determined by others, reflecting the broader patterns of denial and minimization that characterized many war crimes proceedings. The gradual emergence of Holocaust education and commemoration in the 1970s and 1980s brought new attention to Treblinka, though the camp continued to occupy a secondary position compared to more well-documented sites like Auschwitz or Dachau. This relative obscurity reflected not only the successful German cover-up, but also the nearly complete absence of survivors whose stories could capture public attention through media presentations or educational programs. Claude Lanzmann's monumental film Shoah, released in 1985, transformed public understanding of Treblinka through his interviews with survivors and his unprecedented conversation with Franz Suchommel, an SS officer who had served at the camp. Lanzmann's technique of filming at the actual locations while survivors recounted their experiences created a powerful synthesis of testimony and landscape that brought the camp's history into vivid focus for international audiences. The filmmaker's relentless pursuit of detail and his refusal to rely on archival footage forced viewers to confront the reality of mass murder through the words of those who had witnessed it directly. Today, Treblinka occupies a solemn place in the landscape of memory, recognized by scholars as one of the most devastating instruments of Nazi extermination, yet also as a symbol of the enduring struggle to preserve truth against deliberate erasure. Though the perpetrators sought to obliterate every trace of their crimes, the camp's absence of physical ruins has not consigned it to oblivion. Instead, the testimonies of survivors and the dedication of those who study and remember ensure that Treblinka continues to speak, not through monuments of stone, but through the living act of remembrance. In honoring those who perished, we affirm that the attempt to erase them did not succeed. Their memory endures in the stories carried forward, in the scholarship that preserves the facts, and in the conscience of humanity. Remembering Treblinka is not only to confront the depths of human cruelty, but also to recognize the enduring power of testimony, memory, and the refusal to let silence prevail.